The stun shot.
Here's how you stop the cue ball as soon as it strikes the object ball.
Because the balls on a snooker table are designed to be identical, when one strikes another full, it will initially stop, if only for a fraction of a second, no matter how fast it's moving.
The cue ball then only moves if it's spinning, so if it has top spin it will run through, and if it has backspin it will actually come back in the opposite direction.
So how do you take all the spin off the cue ball so when it makes contact with the object ball it doesn't go anywhere?
From this distance I can quite simply strike the cue ball exactly in the centre, and that will stop it spinning at all before it strikes the red.
But as you can see, the further the cue ball moves across the cloth, the more the spin starts to wear out, until it's just rolling across the bed of the table.
So from back here I need to play the shot with more spin and allow that spin to wear off by the time it strikes the red. And if it's not spinning at all by the time it hits the red, it won't move forward or backwards.
And you can see that demonstrated perfectly here as the cue ball just stops spinning the moment it contacts the red.
If the cue ball's rotating forwards but isn't rolling along the table, it's still sliding, this produces what we refer to as a stun run-through shot.
This can be helpful in a number of ways. For example, if you wanted to play the shot a bit harder but still retain control of the cue ball. Or if you want the cue ball to finish somewhere in between a stun shot or where the cue ball would end up if you played the shot as slow as possible. The stun run-through shot allows you to get in this gap. However, if you want the cue ball to run through as far as possible, you're going to want to avoid this shot in favour of a top spin shot. You can see the difference here in slow motion and how much further the top spin shot makes the cue ball go.
To make sure you never unintentionally stun the cue ball, when you play a run-through shot you want to hit it at least the tip length above the centre, and this will mean it will run through predictably.
The problem is it's really easy to strike the cue ball too low if your bridge isn't high enough. You need to really bring your knuckles up high and keep your thumb tight into your forefinger so it won't move and dip. Because if this happens, you're going to find you strike the cue ball lower than intended.
If you're new to playing the game, raising your knuckles up high enough does actually take quite a lot of practice, as does keeping a firm bridge and not allowing your thumb to wobble around all over the place. But you will quickly learn to get this right, but in doing so you may encounter another problem that stops you running through as far as you'd like.
This is bouncing because the cue ball isn't spinning forwards if it isn't on the bed of the table, so it won't go as far.
For example, if I want to make the cue ball run down there and back up to the cushion here, and I bounce it, no matter how hard I'm going to hit it, it's not going to quite get there because the spin won't take. What I need to do is get the cue ball spinning on the bed of the table, and if you keep it flatter, it'll run through a lot further. That's why if you really want to make sure the cue ball runs through a long way, then you want to strike up at it just a fraction, and that way you know it's not going to bounce at all.
With backspin, you don't have to worry about the cue ball bouncing so much because it's harder for it to leave the table. There are, however, other things to get right.
But it's difficult to get a lot of backspin on the cue ball without once again having a strong bridge hand. This means flattening it down on the table, but once again keeping your thumb tight against your bridge hand.
This means you can keep your cue relatively parallel to the table instead of having to strike down to reach the bottom of the cue ball, allowing you to play these shots with your regular technique.
Because if you're striking down at the cue ball, this is going to cause you problems, but maybe not the ones you might expect.
Because you may expect it to reduce the amount of backspin you can get on the cue ball, but in reality, striking down doesn't make too much of a difference to this.
But striking down on the cue ball can magnify any mistake, causing you to miss.
The left-hand side I'm putting on the cue ball here may not be enough for the shot to miss, but because I'm striking down on the cue ball, it misses by a long way.
But very often I see players not getting the amount of backspin they want on the cue ball because they don't have the confidence to strike the cue ball low enough.
If you want to get a lot of backspin on the cue ball, you have to be confident striking it about half a tip from the very bottom. This isn't an easy thing to do, and it takes a lot of practice to get right if you want to be able to play these shots consistently.
However, you don't want to practice screwing back on straight shots because you've got to jump out the way every time. Instead, you want to give yourself a slight angle and just see how slowly you can play a screw shot.
You will need to make sure there's enough chalk on your tip, otherwise you'll end up continuously miscuing. But with practice, you'll begin to generate more and more spin on the cue ball with less effort over time.
Another common mistake is not quite pushing the cue through all the way, and this can really reduce backspin as well.
Watch how much faster the cue ball in the bottom shot is spinning because I followed through. This is going to travel probably about twice the distance as the top shot.
To do this, just make sure you're pushing your cue hand through as far as it'll go on each and every shot. So now you should be able to run the cue ball through, stun it dead, and even screw it back. So we can now start to look at some positional shots. And most of the time you have to play position with a shot that's at an angle.
This is fairly simple to understand. The cue ball will go in the opposite direction to which you're cutting the object ball, but where it goes depends on the spin.
And that means on an angled shot like this black, I can run the cue ball through that side of the table for the red using top spin, screw the cue ball back this side of the red using maximum backspin, and actually then use stun to make the cue ball finish anywhere in between.
But of course, to play any of the shots we've looked at so far consistently well and really control the cue ball requires a lot of practice, and this will take some time.
We've got some more complex shots to look at next after we find Inevitably Crazy from Napoli or Greece, which is there.
So let's start with the drag shot.
If you play a shot with a lot of backspin but slow enough for the spin to wear off completely, then it won't come backwards, and we refer to this as a drag shot.
This is often used when a player is desperate for the cue ball not to run on too far, but can also be used for the same reason as the stun run-through shot from earlier, where you just want the cue ball to go on a little bit, not a full run-through shot. However, it can also be played on an untrue table to prevent the cue ball running offline at low speed.
This shot allows you to strike the cue ball quite slowly without ever having to risk it deviating offline. However, it's not exactly the easiest shot to play.
This is because if you just put a trace of side on the cue ball, when the spin wears off, it almost goes in a completely different direction, and it can be very easy to miss these shots. Side spin's a lot more complicated than anything we've looked at so far, like top spin making the cue ball run through, stun making it stop, and backspin making the cue ball screw back.
But side spin doesn't make the cue ball travel sideways. If I play this shot with right hand side, it's not going to go to the right after it strikes the red. And that's because it's rotating, not spinning.
And this rotation has very little effect, because if you strike the cue ball on the left hand side, it deflects very slightly to the right and then begins to spin back to the left. Right hand side deflects to the left and spins back to the right. The slower the cue ball's going, the more it spins across the cloth, but as you can see, this really isn't that much, even when it's going very slowly. It also hits the object ball in a very slightly different direction because it's spinning, but again not by much. But the slight deflection and the spin actually makes the shot very difficult to line up, especially as it's different depending on how hard you play it.
So when you're playing any shot with side spin, it's absolutely vital you know how hard you're going to strike the cue ball, and you don't change your mind about it. Because if I play that exact same shot a little bit harder or a little bit softer, it'll miss in two different directions. It can make it very difficult to line the shot up accurately. So I'll put a video at the end to explain exactly how you do that.
Side spin, however, does make a big difference when you play the cue ball straight towards a cushion. If the cue ball doesn't have any spin on it, it will just simply come back straight, but a little bit of left hand side will make it jump to the left, more will make it jump to the left by further, and right hand side will go in the opposite direction.
But the more of an angle the cue ball strikes the cushion at, the less it affects its direction, and the more it affects its speed. Look how much this cue ball slows down here.
This is because the cushion is to the right of us and we're hitting the cue ball on the same side. This will slow it down and we refer to this as check side.
And if you hit the cue ball on the opposite side to the cushion, which is left-hand side here, it actually makes the cue ball speed up a little bit.
This can be really helpful when you're podding shots and trying to make the cue ball move around the table further. The swerve shot.
Think of this shot just like putting a lot of side spin on the cue ball. But with these shots, you need to strike down on the cue ball a little bit. It's just a case of how much. Generally speaking, if the object ball's a long way away, you only want to raise your bridge a little bit. This flatter angle will allow it to spin more over the greater distance. But if it's a shorter, sharper swerve like we have here, then you want to go with a lot more height.
Striking down on the cue ball with a lot of side will make it swerve, but if we want to make it swerve a lot, we're going to have to borrow the drag effect from earlier. If you strike the cue ball slightly lower as well as on the side, it will slow the cue ball down and allow it to swerve a lot more. But we can add even more spin than that with the Masse shot.
And if you really get good at this, you can make the cue ball completely spin back on itself with the Masse shot. But that's a whole video in itself.
So if you want to see how to play a bunch of crazy shots like that one, have a look at this top video. Or if you want to know more about side spin, have a look at the bottom video. And remember, don't just watch play, and make the commitment to becoming a better player by subscribing to the channel and visit the website. See you later.